I'm really excited to be here. And I know that we're trickling in from lunch, and it's okay. We're gonna start at the very beginning, right? It's a very good place to start. I think that Kubernetes is the Greek it's the Greek for helmsman, right? It's one who steers. And you're like, excellent, we're starting at the beginning. Well, okay, I have to do the traditional second slide because you have to have a second slide, right? I live in Minneapolis. I work at Microsoft, and more on that later. And I podcast with the rest of DevOps. If I sound familiar and you're like, oh, that's where I remember her voice. And I'm also the chief cook and bottle washer for the global organization that runs DevOps Days, which I think we had like 70 events on 6 continents this year. So talk to me if you want to run one in your city. Definitely talk to me if you happen to work at McMurdo Station, because it would be super cool to actually be on 7 whole continents. Okay, sadly, if any of you were here for Zach, he's not able to be here, which is really sad. He is sick. So I would love if everyone wanted to start this talk off right by tweeting some get well wishes to Zach. And again, like if you are like, oh, it's just you, I'm walking out. Yeah, I understand, it's fine. Because Zach does a lot of the webinars with Hashi, so like he's really involved there, and I'm really sad he's not able to be here. So we have to have an outline. So let's kind of, and by the way, whenever somebody puts up an outline like this, I kind of mentally substitute it as like, okay, these are spoilers for this talk. We're going to talk a little bit, just like level setting on what is going on in this ecosystem. We're going to talk about some of the really exciting open source tools. And then, I feel like if people give you a headset mic and a remote and let you stand on the stage, you should definitely prognosticate about the future. So I'm going to do a little bit of that. We'll see. We'll see how much we can get to. Starting with, like, what actually is this container stuff? And if some of you, and I look around the room, and I got to tell you, I've been doing this thing for a couple years now where I stand on stages and look around the room, and you're all getting younger all the time. And I'm kind of like, how much of this stuff, the ancient history stuff, were you actually there for? I don't know. But then I realized there are wonderful young people in this ecosystem who have amazing insights. Like, for example, my colleague, Jessie Frizzell. And she was just speaking last week at GitHub Universe. And pretty much, I could mic drop on a whole talk about containers right there with, hey, containers aren't actually real. And you're like, what? But they are the foundation of all important computing now. Yeah, right. So what is a container? And I think it's important for us to remember that the way we're using containers today is basically taking advantage of like namespaces, define what a process can see, C groups, define what a process can use. These are features in the Linux kernel. And especially when you're having conversations at your organization where people are like, we have very important DevOps digital transformation, what's it, that we must accomplish by the end of Q3. Containers are key to that. And you're like, I never really thought people would be that excited about Linux kernel features, but here we are. And when we're looking at this, I think people get really excited about containers because they imagine all of the wonderful problems that they can solve. And it's true, like they can. Containers make it trivial to produce consistent environments and reproducible, repeatable deployments. I worked at an organization a couple years ago that started running Docker in production in October 2013. When I think the main thing, some of you maybe, if we check the Wayback Machine, we can see, but I think the main thing on Docker's website at that point was giant letters in Blink that said, like, under no circumstances should you run this in production. And the company that I worked at was a little streaming video company, and we were like, YOLO, and did. And got acquired by Warner Brothers, so I guess sometimes YOLO works out. But I think what people get excited about those stories, and I feel like I have to also kind of demystify and tell them that containers are not going to magically solve all the woes in your code base, and they're not going to magically solve all of the problems in your organization. They might make some of them worse. And because it gives you something new to manage, and it gives you new failure modes to worry about. Containers are not going to magically make everything awesome. And at the same time, people get excited about containers because it seems like this great new thing. And I'm kind of like, not so much. Because I got my CS degree, by the way, back in the 90s, back when the CS departments would give root on their faculty members' machines to undergraduates, because it was the 90s and many things seemed like a good idea at the time. And we were using containers then, because they're not actually new, right? So like, containers have been, in one way or another, with us for quite some time, but they are a lot more usable today. Right? So like, if, make some noise if you used FreeBSD jails or if you use Solaris zones. Like, all right, there's a few of you. I'm not the only one who remembers that stuff. And it's like, this was useful. We used it for a reason. It was kind of a pain, but we used it for a reason, right? It solved problems for us. And at the same time, when containers started becoming more mainstream, it was, I feel like the genius of Docker is that they took something that was only accessible to a small population and made it significantly easier for nearly everyone to use. And at the same time, like, the future is still pretty unevenly distributed because not everyone can even say that they're using containers in their organization today. Certainly not everyone is using Kubernetes because, I mean, obviously, like here I have on the screen here saying that Kubernetes is way too newfangled for your enterprise to be, yeah. It's like, this is not actually new. It's been around for, 4 years and some change, and at the same time, it's not the end game, right? It's just an orchestrator. Nomad's an orchestrator. There's DCOS. Like, there's a lot of orchestrators in the space. And when you're trying to think, like, what problems are you trying to solve? I think that's where the conversation about containers should be. Because the orchestrating and the care and feeding thereof they're a means. Like, they're not an end. I feel like it's really important for us to, and I really appreciated what Armand was saying about some of the nuance in choosing orchestrators in the keynotes this morning. Because just because something has a lot of airtime does not mean that it's the right solution for the problems you have. And I think that, honestly, the whole container and orchestrating space is a place I would watch out in your organizations, maybe in your own heart, for resume-driven development. Because people get really excited about something shiny, and they usually say, like, I definitely need to start a Kubernetes initiative. And I'm like, what problems are you trying to solve? And it's amazing how sometimes the problem that they're trying to solve is that they want to have a Kubernetes initiative by Q3. It's like, well, so that's, even though I'm going to talk about some exciting tech in the space, I want to make sure that we're level setting in terms of should we? And the answer is usually, what problem is it going to solve for you? It's amazing the answers you'll get if you ask that in your organization. Okay, so that's the reality check portion. Let's talk about some of the tools in this ecosystem. I think that it's a very confusing space, probably not intentionally. I shouldn't assume people do it on purpose. I will say that there's a former boss of mine, Tim Gross at Drama Fever, likes to call it conservation of complexity, which is to say, whatever tool you choose, it's not going to make anything magically simple. Like, say microservices become popular, and so you definitely need microservices, and so you've now replaced your IPC with transient network failures. It's like, okay, you didn't make a problem go away, you moved it around. And that is actually completely legit. Like, it makes a lot of sense, but it's basically conservation of complexity. It's something that I think is really important when we're starting to work in this kind of complex space for us to think about, is when we're using tools like Kubernetes to move the complexity around, we should be cognizant of that. You can't ignore it. Okay, so talking about orchestration, and again, there are plenty of orchestrators out there. And Kubernetes is not the only one, although it's the one that I'm talking about some of the tools for the ecosystem. But if you are using Nomad or other orchestrators, you can definitely think about these elements because they're pretty important, right? Like, what is the orchestration doing for you? Hopefully, it's doing some kind of scheduling and moving and monitoring of workloads. It's basically all of the things that when you built your homegrown platform, and you did, because we all did, all of the janky bash, like, you probably got really tired of maintaining, and that's the stuff that's mostly moving into your orchestration systems now. And if you're saying like, oh, we don't use Bash in production, and I'm like, all right, when you build your own platform, it's probably built out of like Docker and Packer and Chef and your cloud of choice and like the underlying substrate of all of the Bash that you hope somebody is checking exit codes. Like this is true. Like just admit it. But you probably want a bunch of this stuff in your orchestration, which is why when people are looking to Kubernetes, as an example of orchestration, you want the extensible but also self-healing built into it. If you're cobbling together a lot of this stuff yourself right now, you probably want to be looking at some kind of orchestration layer. Again, that doesn't mean this is the right one for you. In fact, I think if you're trying to make some decisions, talk to the fine folks at Hashi, because Armand gave a really good description this morning of how you make some of those decisions about where the trade-off of complexity and features is for you. But we also heard from Mitchell about Hashi's Kubernetes support. So it is a choice. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about architecture. You can look at architecture diagrams. I think that it's useful to understand that there's a control plane that in some of your managed services is not going to be something you have to worry about. And then there's going to be a bunch of your worker nodes, which can be VMs or bare metal or whatever. And if your master or your control plane, and again, like master is kind of a useless term because you very frequently could have multiple. In fact, if you're going for HA, you probably have multiple nodes in your control plane. But it may or may not run on VMs. It definitely is going to be using some etcd, or you need your state to go somewhere. And if you're groaning and thinking, state, but I thought this magical container cloud stuff made that not a problem. Like, oh, I have a bridge to sell you. OK. Well, because people love showing you. I got to give you a pro tip of dealing with vendors. When they show you the demo that is super stateless and like smooth, be like, cool, OK, I want to see the demo with like database failover. Because otherwise, like, I assume you have state where your customers and your money live. And if you don't, congratulations on your exciting new startup. I hope that it goes really well and you get some state, which matters. But I think that it's another thing we can look at when we're talking about components in Kubernetes is this idea of a pod. And I think that if you're not used to Kubernetes, the idea of pod can be one or more containers. It's sharing the same context and resources. And at this point, you're suddenly like sidecars. And I'm like, yeah, there's a lot of different ways to do this. But there's a bunch of other components here that are kind of interesting. Every one of these that I look at, I'm like, OK, so Kubernetes is a fast-moving open source project. Every time they release, there are exciting breaking changes. So it's not the sort of thing where you're going to run like head at all times. No, you won't. But they also are constantly renaming everything in here. So you're basically every single slide you read, old conference talk, tutorial, you're probably going to have to do a lot of like mental substitutions as to what's being updated. So like keep that in mind. But like again, without diving too much into the stuff in here, kubeproxy does network proxying. The couplet, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit, is basically a process watcher. So it makes sure that the specified containers that you're expecting are running. And then, yeah, OK, that's enough about that probably. So I would say like on a higher level, like what people are trying to get out of Kubernetes and some of the things that would help you choose a tool like this, and again, you have to dive into the details when you're deciding between Kubernetes and other tools, but is the quick deployment and reliability of like predictable deployments, predictable and pretty simple scaling. The idea of being able to do a lot of very nuanced rollouts of new features or whatever in your application. You can set all of your tolerances as to like, are we OK with overrunning our capacity a little bit? Maybe our cloud bill is higher. I work for a cloud. That sounds OK. But you also don't want it to be too high, because otherwise everything is bad. And so like you can set exactly how much you can burst, and then how willing you are to have any request be dropped on the floor. Say you have none, then okay. Like there's a lot of toggles that you can switch. I would say especially for people who are looking at on-prem or a hybrid solution or just trying to control their cloud spend, it's valuable to be able to limit the hardware usage. So you can say, we only want these resources. We're only going to provision to these resources. So that's pretty useful. OK, but this talk promised a little bit of detail about day 2. And I think a lot of people are like, excellent, I am definitely going to Kubernetes. I want to have Kubernetes. What do I do next? And I think that you kind of have to look at the tools that will help you solve the problems you're trying to solve, which, all right, we're getting beyond 101, but also everyone has a very different problem set. And so let's talk about some of the tools that can help you make it more operable, which is to say you want to move past the cool, I saw a demo, to what could I actually do day to day. And it's a pretty big and complex space. So and the little corner of it that I'm contributing in is really trying to make this stuff more usable. So I would break it up into 3 sections, like getting started with Terraform is super useful, obviously, and like on Azure, probably AKS. Then managing your configs and your apps, because you can end up with so much YAML. When I run workshops for Kubernetes, I feel like I have to give a content warning for YAML. Like, OK, YAML may be upsetting to you. Many of us feel this way. There is lots and lots of YAML. But you can use tools like Helm to make that a little bit better. And then the event-driven scripting. So let's talk about some of that. OK, so Terraform in Azure. So I started getting some slides ready to talk about this. And then Mitchell covered it in the keynote this morning, so I was like, excellent. But basically, the idea of a lot of people are trying to do hybrid cloud stuff, so you want your workflow to be the same across environments. And it's pretty cool using the Kubernetes provider inside Terraform to actually deploy the pods and services to your Kubernetes cluster. So if you're like, excellent, I want to go look into this. And these slides will be online later. And there's a URL here. If you're using Azure, you can go check out all of the stuff they've been working on. I started screen capping it, and I was like, literally, this slide's impossible to read, and there's another page or 2. So just go take a look, because that's only some of the results of that search. And then I was really excited this morning because the idea of being able to deploy your managed Kubernetes right into AKS through Terraform, and then deploy your services and pods right into that AKS cluster that you just created, using the exact same code base, but with a different provider. It's the sort of thing that we're always talking about wanting to make repeatable workflows and make things more usable. And it's like, yeah, that's how we do that. OK, so that was, I literally had to add this slide like an hour ago, because I was like, this is perfect. OK. AKS, it's your managed solution. And if you're thinking to yourself, but I ran through Kelsey's Kubernetes the hard way, and it was so exciting. Yeah, absolutely it was. And are you planning on up-leveling everyone at your organization and having them all be able to support every single nuance of running it yourself? Maybe. In which case, you're probably, Heptio or something. And if you don't work at a vendor who it's your main raison d'etre to make Kubernetes clusters work really well, you may find that you might want to, I don't know, actually do what your organization profits from. So using the managed solutions with your cloud provider of choice is probably a good idea. There are a lot of open source APIs so that you can scale and run your applications, but not worry about the infrastructure. So that's worth looking at. Again, all of the cloud providers have, hopefully some very simple mechanisms to get started. So I feel like this isn't one of those things where we need to sit and look at every single detail. You can be like, literally, I just create and have the CLI and look at the nodes. OK, cool. That's not production ready. Obviously, that's just seeing a managed cluster. But if you're managing it, it's one of the things that you're doing a lot usually is there's either new features or there's 0 days or whatever. And so you absolutely need to do an upgrade. But it gets really annoying trying to hand things off and make sure that the upgrade goes well, and like there's in-place upgrading for these managed solutions. So that's probably worth, managing, upgrading, scaling. It's probably worth looking at. Like, again, we're all technologists, we're all smart. We can do all of these things. We have to decide which ones to spend the most time on. So that's what some of these solutions are good for. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about Helm next because, and I had it on the list for a reason, and not just because a bunch of my colleagues at Microsoft now work, they do work on it, but it's actually a CNCF incubating project now. So it's under Cloud Native Computing Foundation governance, and it's really kind of great. And it's basically the solution for what ails you in terms of all of that YAML, which is to say you want versioning it's basically your package manager. So you have versioning and sharing and releases and release rollbacks, which I have a problem with that word, rollback, because I always think like, okay, share's wrong. You cannot turn back time. You definitely cannot you can't get back to the state that you were in. Wouldn't it be great? You can roll forward to something that you hope is like the state where you weren't being paged, but like you can't actually turn back time. But having good versioning of, yes, some YAML does help a lot in that space. So, there's a lot of, I feel like I jumped ahead because I was so excited about that, but I'll just click through these quickly. Like, the Helm charts are where you keep all of this information. The updates become way less annoying. And I do think the sharing is really valuable because when you want to use like Prometheus or something, you could be like, I could go read the directions and install Prometheus. This will be 800 commands. Or you can just install the Helm chart and you're running Prometheus. So that is one of the ways to get things running on your Kubernetes cluster much faster. And also, again, you've set your own release checkpoints, and you can get back to a previous version without too much pain. OK, so you're thinking, all right, that sounds great, but my cluster itself is not the only thing I'm managing. I'm also trying to operate, I don't know, my software, like the entire reason I have a cluster. And for that, I would recommend looking at Draft. It's another open source project that we and other organizations contribute a bunch to. And it's app development and in deployment. So you get a couple of commands. You can deploy your applications, and you can get like the kind of help you're looking for to not have to constantly write the Docker files, write the Helm charts. Like, raise your hand if you absolutely adore writing YAML. I don't see any. I see one joker, two jokers raising their hand. It's like, yeah. So basically, this is a tool that can make it a lot easier for you to generate the configuration that you need in order to be able to manage your tooling. Or sorry, by which I mean your application. That you're like, it was great installing other people's stuff with Helm. I would like to do that with my stuff. So you can do that in any language. So, all right, so another thing to take a look at is Brigade. And this one, and if you were watching, GitHub Universe, you're kind of like, but wait, GitHub Actions. OK, yes, they are now in this space. For now, they're only for private repos. Also, like, this is it's event-driven scripting that you can use right now. And it kind of looks like there's parallel evolution there, and there's already some issues in the Brigade repo, because of course this is all developed in the open, so you can take a look at that. But it's worth looking at because, I mean, it looks like GitHub is going to be part of Microsoft soon, which is awesome. And I think that these evolutionary branches are probably going to grow together. But what you do with this is, with Kubernetes, you define everything as desired state. And it's like desired state configuration. But if you want to do things based on events, like that doesn't really work. So then, if you use, like if you need if this then that, like workflow engine stuff, you can use Brigade to write JavaScript to define your complex pipelines and like model whatever arbitrary workflow that you have. So that's the sort of thing that if again, it's impossible for me to advise if something is right for your use case because I am talking and you are not. So like after this, I will be at the Microsoft booth and I will be listening, and we would love to, I'd love to talk to you about this stuff. But Like when you're figuring out if this is right for you, take a look at, do you have things you need to trigger based on events? So that's worth looking at. Also, like if you look at Cashtea, this is a UI to display your events. This is basically, how do you know if your event-based task failed? So it's a dashboard. It gives you a view of all your event pipelines, like failures, logs, the kind of stuff that you definitely could build, but do you want to? Because there's open source, yay. Okay, all right, so we have a lot. We've now kind of done a quick tour of a lot of building blocks that you can use. None of those are the answer to everything forever. They're a building block you can use to create your deployments, basically, so that you can create the deployments that you can repeat. Because you know how like when you proof of concept something and you deploy it and it works and people are like, that's exciting. And you're like, that was really a pain to do, but I'm glad I got it done. And then somebody says, do it 18 more times with these subtle changes. And you're like, oh, my life. So this is the attempt to make that a little bit less painful. And, of course, move things between all of our environments. OK, so if we're looking to what's coming next, first of all, the very first thing that's coming next, I hope everyone who is a voter, an eligible voter in the United States is going to do, is I really hope that you vote. And notice that I am not telling you what you should do with your choice, because it is your franchise. But it is really important. And like statistics on the internet and things tell me that many people choose to not be heard. And I'm like, really? Because I want people to listen to me all the time. And like, oh, so you probably want people to listen to you. So I highly suggest making that happen. But other than that, I think it's really important. I got to have apologies to Ian Fleming because it's not actually diamonds that are forever. I mean, they are probably. I don't know. I'm not really into diamonds. But day 2 operations need to keep working, right? It's kind of trivial to get something working on day 1. And I feel that the people I've been talking to here at HashiCorp who are in the great, we need operability and repeatability space, understand this already. And we have to get our organizations to understand that once some software works in production, you're going to want to keep changing it, and you're going to want to have the ability to update it safely. And like you definitely need tooling like the stuff we've talked about. And I think that that's not the only dire portent. I think that it's pretty important for us to remember that all of these things that feel really new and exciting, like, yeah, I mean, they are new and exciting, but wow, this stuff is getting really real. Like, your bank and airline and government are probably now deciding to Kubernetes. And like, they want to start and continue using it and be successful. Maybe you work at some of those institutions and like, oh, hey, how do you feel about breaking changes now? Like, maybe not. So I think it's pretty important for us to be thinking about day 2 operations. And like whenever we're YOLOing something out into production because it seemed like a good idea at the time, having those conversations inside our organizations. And that means we have to learn a lot. And you're at a conference, which is a really good place to do that. I've noticed one of the things that's challenging about going to a conference is you get back to the office and you're like, I learned so much, it was great. And people are like, excellent, teach it all to us now. And you're like, it was great. There will be videos. I will suggest that you take a look at container.training. That is an open source container training module that some colleagues and I have been working on and collaborators across the space. It was actually started by Jerome Petazzoni. You might know him from his work at a little company called .cloud that later became Docker. So that is worth looking at just so that you can run yourself through some learning opportunities, just like the awesome stuff at HashiCorp Learn that's come out now. I also think it's really a good idea, even though you are definitely smart enough to set up Kubernetes from scratch. And I would strongly encourage everyone not to, because like it's, at least to start with, it's way easier for other people to be on call for it if you have some people in your support chain who focus just on that and don't work at your organization. Like, I remember it was like 2012, and I was working at a startup that was using Hadoop. and it was like in our critical path. And I set up, MapReduce from scratch, and then I went to our cloud provider and was like, hosted MapReduce solution. This is definitely something we're going to use because I'm a one-woman ops team, and all these devs are on call with me, and I might be able to fix the thing I stand up from, from GitHub, and maybe they won't. And it's like, you have to choose where to spend your complexity tokens. And hopefully, I was very excited at lunch to see James Waters from Pivotal. And if you don't know him, you should definitely go check him out on Twitter. And hopefully he's tweeting on the conference hashtag so you can find him easily. But I like to think of it as he talks about the value line, as in which stuff is going to provide differentiating value to our organization that I work at, and which stuff is not. And I can't tell you the answer to that for your organization because it's always going to be different. But it's very probable that running a cloud provider or running a platform service is not where your organization gets most of its value. And so it's really valuable, I think, to think about where you want to spend those complexity tokens. OK, so other future-looking stuff. There is a very cool project going on, and no, not those Packers. Like, we are at HashiCorp, so the Packer we're talking about is building images, and Azure is starting to offer it as a service. So there's a link there. It's very new, so it's worth checking out. There's Helm 3 is coming out. And it's so new that I can basically just point you to a blog post and some stuff on GitHub. So if you like the opportunity, especially if you're using Helm and you have like opinions about Tiller or opinions about Lua or whatever, if you have pull-based workflows and you're very excited about Helm controller stuff, it's worth taking a look and having your voice heard, because right now is the time to have an outsized and like significant effect on open source projects. So that's a good one to look at. And then if you haven't seen virtual kubelet, and especially if you have data centers of your own, that is probably worth looking at because it lets you add anything you want to your Kubernetes cluster. So like you have a giant data center somewhere, sure, it's now registered itself as a node. And you can have developers deploying pods to it. And you're like, excellent, our bursting bill in the cloud is way lower now because we've been able to add our existing data center as part of our Kubernetes cluster. So it's worth taking a look at. Even if it doesn't solve a problem you have now, knowing that those sort of things are possible might help you come up with the right solutions for you. OK, so I think I've taken you on a whirlwind tour of a lot of things happening in the open source space there. And I also want to point out from my colleague, Eric St. Martin, who runs GopherCon, that Kubernetes, with apologies to Halt and Catch Fire, he says Kubernetes is not the thing. It's the thing that gets us to the thing. It's not even the only thing, but like containerized abstractions make for better portability. Great. Especially if your organizations are thinking about public cloud. Cool. You're probably going to Kubernetes. Awesome. That's not the end game. Like when we look at the end game, when we think about the fact that the world just keeps changing around us, which is kind of exciting, I like to point out what Jeffrey Snover said just recently, that Azure is over 50% Linux. Like, people don't realize that, but it is. And I think and I bring that up specifically because I think that it's valuable to not just think about the past, but also think about the future that we can create. I mean, recently, Microsoft used to have opinions on open source. Microsoft just open sourced all our patents. So it's like, I think that from that we can conclude that change is probably the only thing that's going to keep happening in open source 1, which is awesome. So yeah, this is my pinned tweet because it sounds ridiculous and sublime at the same time. And I think that I work at Microsoft. They gave me a Mac with a Microsoft asset tag on it, and my job is to get people to use Linux, from which we can definitely conclude that this timeline is not what any of us expected 20 years ago. But I joined because I think Microsoft is genuinely focused on open source to create a better world. And I think that's something that you can all do too. Like, you actually have the power to do that. Not just by voting, though you should, but by creating the infrastructure of the world we all live in. So I have links here, and again, I podcast too much, so I was going to say links in the show notes, but no, I will tweet the slides. There's a lot of stuff to check out here. Zach has a repo with a bunch of demos in it that you can check out if you want to play, a lovely copy of the home game. And I am going to be up at our booth the rest of today. I won't be here tomorrow, but I'll be up at our booth the rest of the today. If we can chat about some of this stuff, we'd love to talk. Thank you so much.